BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Jeito Capital, a leading global independent private equity fund with a patient benefit-driven approach aimed at financing and accelerating the development of groundbreaking medical innovation. Jeito's unique investment strategy combines significant capital and collective expertise to support companies and their management teams, ranging from clinical development to market access for cutting-edge innovations, with one main objective: go faster for the patient. Learn more at jeito.life.
President Trump's biopharma policies have introduced an element of turbulence and unpredictability to the U.S. biopharma landscape, but we ask, could this be an opening for Europe? Plus, Deal-O-Rama. Alexander Hardy spoke to Stephen and Simone in an exclusive interview to discuss Biomarin's first acquisition in 10 years. And Boston Pharma parlayed a liver disease asset into one of the largest ever upfronts for a single asset in a biotech deal. And Lars Bjerregaard Jorgensen, the leader who spearheaded Novo Nordisk's transformation into a dominant player in obesity, is stepping aside after a year of successes and some significant setbacks. We look at his legacy and what's next for the Danish pharma. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me to discuss all of this on the BioCentury This Week podcast are my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Okay, before we jump into all of that, I'd just like to remind our listeners that Grand Rounds, BioCentury's second annual R&D conference, is coming to Chicago in early June, right after ASCO. We have a limited number of seats left and a limited number of presenting company spots left. If you are interested, we have a special rate for listeners of the podcast. You can reach out to me or conferences at biocentury.com. Simone, it's going to be a good conference, right?
It is going to be a pizzazz conference, actually. We have a great lineup of speakers and panel topics, and all of the websites that Jeff tells you to go to, you should go to get the details on that, because I'm not going to walk through them on this. We'll mention them on other podcasts and so on. Yeah, space is kind of running out. I mean, there is some, so I will get onto that with the discounts that you can as a podcast listener. I also do want to give a shout out to folks in the Chicago area, in particular VCs, finance people, banky people. The Chan Zuckerberg Chicago BioHub is hosting an exclusive reception on June the 3rd. That is the eve of the Grand Rounds Conference. And they are going to be bringing together top folks in biotech innovation and investment, get to know them, spark collaborations, channel the energy of Chicago's thriving innovation ecosystem. These are the words. So there'll be a networking dinner, opening remarks from the president of the Chan Zuckerberg BioHub in Chicago. So if you are interested in attending, we have a link in the show notes that you will be able to register at. And that is really one worth going to. So that is, even if you sadly can't make it to Grand Rounds, which I think you should come to, that's a good networking event.
And if you're listening in Europe or taking Grand Rounds on the road, we'll be in Cambridge, UK. The motherland, as Stephen Hansen
not to be confused with any other Cambridge, where we will not be.
There's another
the original,
the real Cambridge,
the OG Cambridge,
the OG Cambridge, because they got some good stuff happening in the other Cambridge,
which we may talk about as Europe's opportunity. Saying
we will get there. That's in September. You'll hear more about that on the podcast, but we are already recruiting presenting companies. So hey, if you're listening in Finland, if you're in Austria, you've got seed stage money, some early innovative tech, you're a Series A company, you're preclinical, you're phase 1, you're into the hot new modalities, drop me a line, and we'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's dig in. You may have heard of President Donald Trump. He has something of a unique leadership style. It has biotech on the back foot a little bit. Recently, we heard about his new drug pricing policy, most favored nation. There's been big cuts at FDA, some signs of changing policies. Lauren did a nice piece on Vinay Prasad, the new CBER head, last week. And NIH, well, NIH, there's a dark cloud over NIH. And so Stephen and Simone and Selena, they were all just off in Belgium at the 25th annual Bioequity Europe conference, and they had the ears to the ground. They were on a lot of panels talking about, is this now the moment for European biotech to seize many opportunities? All right, so you were all there. Who wants to jump in first? Simone?
Well, why not? Where to start? I think we started by talking about the complexity of the moment. And I think that when you talk about Europe and every year we talk about Europe doesn't have enough growth capital and it needs to do this and it needs to do that. And then you get a lot of eye rolling, like, they're never going to do that. Don't look at me like that, Stephen. They do. Okay. So really, I'm going to throw this to Selena and Stephen. I really feel like the vibe was different this year. And that's partly through to I'm going to use the word trauma, right? But there is a trauma, or whatever's going on in the US, turmoil, if not trauma, maybe, creates a different kind of opportunity in Europe. Because in the past, even if Europe had improved its capital market or its regulatory system, there's always this sense that you're so far behind the US. And so there was never any kind of urgency behind it. And now I think that when we're talking to people, there's this idea of a moment in time. We know for sure that the talent flow is an opportunity for Europe to retain and even bring back some. There are others, and maybe Stephen, you can talk a little bit more detail about this, that there are limits both for companies in company formation and operation and also at EMA that are sort of structural or just efficiency limits or bottlenecks, some of which could be smoothed quite easily if they got together and paid attention to it to make it a more friendly environment. So I'll throw it to the others, but I just feel that there's this feeling with Europe now, its opportunity to step in and make a difference is really very much tied to what's going on in the US rather than anything uniquely happening in Europe.
So, so the thing that struck me, Simone, I think it came up in your opening plenary session and at the session that followed on the opening night at Bioequity, and it was about the opportunity to attract talent, right? Because I think from my perspective, and I wrote in the perspective that I wrote the week prior to Bioequity running, sort of talking about these different ways from a regulatory standpoint that Europe could, take advantage of the opportunity. But, part of the challenge in Europe is that given sort of the leviathan of bureaucracy that is the European Union, it's a slow moving boat. And so trying to capture something by a legislative process, I think is going to be a hard push and a hard sell. So what I was really sort of intrigued by was, what are other things you can do that don't involve a legislative action that you can really try and take advantage? And one of those that was raised was this idea of trying to retain, but then also attract back talent, particularly maybe from Europe, people that are of European descent that, had maybe moved to the States because of opportunity there, sort of analogous to what we saw, the Chinese government do with the sea turtles, where they were looking to bring back very talented people that had come to the US, gained experience there and then bring them back to help develop the Chinese biotech sector, sort of do something very similar in Europe. Can you bring back the talent and basically be able to say, I know you had trouble getting your NIH funding to go through, come back to Europe where we have a much more stable environment, where we're much more friendly to, doing R&D projects, where you don't have to worry about what words you use in your funding grants to get them through. So that was, to me, one of the most intriguing and I guess what I would call maybe the low-hanging fruit of opportunities that Europe potentially has.
Yeah, I think of the opportunities in different buckets, right? There's the stuff happening with NIH creating this opportunity right now to grab talent. People are out of jobs. People can't get their grants funded. They're looking around. They're applying elsewhere. And now's your moment. On the regulatory front, a bunch of people laid off of FDA. they've chosen to make a life in regulation, public service. Might they want to go over to Europe, work at EMA or some other agency? And then you have a whole separate thing with the reference pricing, most favored nation framework that's been proposed. That could create an opportunity as well. But of course, there are very long-standing structural issues, fragmented markets. Europe has its own internal reference pricing, issues. So there, I think the fixes are a little less clear.
Yeah, can I just add a couple of things? Because I think both of those are correct. So, Stephen, to your point about talent, I mean, we are hearing that is already happening, right? We are hearing anecdotally, we don't have data, that more and more what you call like originally European VCs are, excited to go back to Europe. And therefore there's like a recycling of talent that Europe can capitalize on. Selena, I thought one of the interesting concepts that came up regarding pricing, or at least getting the EC to move in that direction, was this idea that you don't necessarily have to get 27 countries to move at the same time. You could have smaller units. So, I don't know if it would be the Benelux countries, or if you could get groups of countries to start agreeing within them, that is actually the way forward. And that actually seems like something that could be tractable. You can get 2 countries or 3 countries to agree on something, because it's not that in order to get the European market, you need, Slovakia, every small nation there. There are bigger and smaller populations.
Right. So something that could be done within blocks of countries would be harmonizing the HTA assessment, for example.
Yeah. And we hear over and over again about the fact that they require, this is very costly to pharma companies, the fact that they require different standards and so on. This is just, makes no sense scientifically even.
And just to add something that's a bit more current, something I actually saw today, as an example of something that can be done. So the UK government, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology put out an announcement saying that they were going to be extending the timeline for R&D funding in the UK to a 10-year budget window. So giving this very long term so that they can plan. But of interesting note, as part of that, so one of the 4 kind of focus areas was going to be on retention and attraction of talent. That was going to be an area that they were going to be focusing on here. So just as an example, I mean, these are things that individual countries, both the UK and obviously countries within the EU, you can prioritize, and you can make it sort of a priority of your science policy, of your R&D policy, to try and, bring these back to beyond what we're going to see happen either individual companies or at VC firms.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of points and loop it back to the China thing. So on the one hand, I would not, having also come from the UK and watched a brain drain there, I would not discount the long-term effects of moving talent, right, and attracting talent. And so however long this lasts in the US for, it's really generational. Sort of once people launch their careers and move and embed families and find a comfortable place to live, I understand that the other things take longer, but talent is a very, very important part of our ecosystem. The other thing, bringing it back to China, which, as you pointed out earlier in the podcast, has done this extremely well, is that what we did and what we will be publishing soon, yes, Selena, I will get you that deck, is an analysis of the deals with China. So not just China, actually Asia. So their innovation ecosystem has really fueled a rising number of deals with assets being licensed out to Western companies and farmers. And so Europe is actually part of that picture, meaning Europe is engaging with Chinese biotechs and other Asian biotechs to partner on their innovation and to capitalize on that. They're a little bit further ahead in some areas like cancer and further behind in other areas like I&I. But, I would expect that for Europe to really emerge, it will need to create ties with another really emerging ecosystem and see them as partner rather than exclusively as competitor.
Yeah, and partner just to accelerate early clinical trials. I mean, you had that great Q&A session with the CEO of Biotech. I don't know if you want to.
Well, that was really a highlight for me. So Jean-Pierre Leterre is an incredibly dynamic and interesting CEO. Write that name down, folks. You'll hear more, I'm sure, about him in due course. He launched Biotech about 4 or 5 years ago, kicked it off with money from friends and family, got a little bit of seed financing with European funds, actually, and then added some VC funding, basically raising about 14 million within 4 years or so. He managed to create a deal with AstraZeneca, who has bought the company, for a nice $425 million up front and about $1 billion, I think, in total deal value, depending on milestones. But the story of how he got there is incredibly compelling. A real story of focus. He's working on in vivo CAR Ts. He'd previously worked on first autologous and then allogeneic. And, his journey took him to what he sees as the limitations of those. And then, working on in vivo CAR T. And to your point, Selena, about China, he did early clinical trials in China. And that data was what actually made the deal with AstraZeneca happen. So we'll be following that.
Yeah, they were this little known company and not much money. There was several in vivo CAR T companies ahead of them, much better funded, the big blue chip investors, and he just managed to springboard ahead using that particular strategy that blended the strengths of Europe and China. Not saying that everybody could follow suit, because there was a kind of unique opportunity there for benchmarking his in vivo CAR T construct against an identical one that had been tested by the same group in a cell therapy. But there must be other opportunities along these lines if people have their eyes open to look for them.
Yeah, and that idea of leveraging China as part of the strategy for a Western biotech, that is going to be a big theme of the China Healthcare Summit this October in Shanghai. And the word that I've heard from our colleague Josh, who is also at BioEquity and is a sometimes guest on the pod, is that the chatter at BioEquity was that if you don't have a China strategy, if you're not paying attention on who's out there with tech that can help you in China or running trials in China, you're going to get left behind. So what can I say? The Xiaolong Bao at our conference are also delicious, but these are the themes that we're going to be talking about. So definitely reach out, China Healthcare Summit, and check out how you can get involved in that. Reach out to me, reach out to Josh, and you'll get some good word. But BioEquity, we did do a podcast live on stage at BioEquity, and we're going to release that later this week with some of the takeaways from the conference. Stephen was on the mic for that. Stephen, how'd that go?
It was great. Yeah, it was fun. I really actually enjoyed doing it live. Having Simone and Josh were our BioCentury guests, and then we had Senya Pavlitek from Jeito and Ann Horgan from Cambridge Innovation Capital joining us as special guests. We got a bit even more in depth, I would say, in some of the topics about European opportunities and stuff. So look out for that, and we'll dive in even deeper.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk deal making.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandraunds.com.
It's been a quiet start to the year for deals in biotech, but last week we had two that really caught our eye. First up, Biomarin, the Northern California biotech that develops drugs for genetically defined diseases, has bought Inozyme, a company that recently went public, small cap, about $270 million. It's the first of a planned string of deals for Biomarin, and it's the first deal under the 30-year-old company's new leadership. Alexander Hardy, the Genentech veteran, he came in December 2023 to succeed Jean-Jacques Bien-Aimé, longtime leader of Biomarin, and Hardy has since brought in veteran dealmaker James Sabry, who is making his return to biotech after nearly 15 years at Roche. Stephen, you had a chance to speak to Alex and James. What did you learn?
Yeah, well, first, I think you nailed the enunciation on that name, Jeff. So well done. That was
It's very rare that I pull that off. I'm going to go for a big one in the last segment. So just wait for that. You guys can put money down on whether or not I get anywhere close to how to say that name.
Yeah, no. So I mean, it was as you said, it was a rather small deal for Biomarin, but I think that it seems like they're in this really sort of good transition period where they've got some growth products now that are growing. They're growing their profitability, so they've become profitable. So they've got a growing cash flow, and I think they brought in James. Shout out to James, friend of the show, for giving us an interview. And it sounds like they're really trying to look to utilize that free cash flow now and try and build out the pipeline, rather than just being reliant on sort of internal innovation sort of things. They're really looking to pad it with external opportunities. And, I think this is really the right time to be shopping, right? Because lots of stuff are relatively cheap on a valuation basis. There's lots of companies that may be running short of cash. Like I think Inozyme, was sort of a good example of this, of a company that basically their cash runway kind of coincided with the readout for their phase 3 programs. They were a company where I think it would have been really tough for them to raise any capital, ahead of a binary readout like they've got coming up in the first quarter of 2026. So I think this is kind of a win-win for both of them. It sort of is the first in a string of deals for Biomarin. It kind of fit right into their wheelhouse of skeletal diseases and enzyme replacement therapies. And from what James said, I mean, it sounds like they're going to be looking to do more. I think they were, you mentioned that there'd be multiple deals. Yeah, it was a good deal for them.
Stephen, I thought another really interesting thing, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about FDA, and now with the announcement of Vinay Prasad at the helm of CBER, what's the environment now? But really, they're in rare diseases, and their position is this is a great environment for them. They really feel like DC, the things that the administration is moving towards. I just want to stipulate that this was by no means a political conversation or endorsement one way or another, but really just in terms of the policies that they are seeing in terms of orphan drug diseases and enabling that, and rare diseases, a friendly environment for that. So they really felt that this is going to be for them and companies like them, actually a fairly good landscape.
Yeah, no, I think the way I took the conversation was that rare diseases, orphan diseases are maybe one of the few places that are unlikely to be the target of any, potential upheaval. And so I think one of the phrases, I can't remember whether it was Alexander or James, but he sort of used, sort of said that rare diseases are going to be something of a safe harbor, in this environment. And so that on a relative basis gives them a good opportunity to keep pushing on, whereas other companies may be bumping into hurdles and that sort of thing if they're working in other areas. So it'll be interesting to be, as we said, small deal, but I'm very curious to see kind of what they look to pick up next.
All right, and Stephen's story up on biocentury.com. You can also find it at biocenturypodcast.com, and I'll drop a link into the show notes. Now, the other deal that caught our eye last week came from GSK and Boston Pharma. Until a few years ago, Boston Pharma was something of a diffuse organization, had about 15 assets in its pipeline. That's until CEO Sophie Kornowski made a liver disease program the company's top priority, and now with the therapy ready for phase 3 testing, along comes GSK to acquire the molecule for $1.2 billion upfront. Now, that upfront payment is among the 7 largest upfront payments for a single product deal since BioCentury began collecting deals data in 2009. The largest, of course, the $1.65 billion paid by Roche to Zealand Pharma for an obesity asset back in March. Stephen, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about this asset? What makes it special?
Sure. I did notice, though, that you did sidestep having to try and pronounce the name of the asset. So maybe I can do my best here.
You're holding my feet to the fire today, Stephen. I appreciate that.
Efimosfermin alpha, I believe, is the name of this asset. It's an FGF21
At my house, we just like to call it BOS 580.
Got it. Okay.
Find it rolls off.
So
Can
is
go
this
by
one of
that
your
name.
kids' favorite molecules, Jeff, when you say at your house?
We're really hoping there's not liver disease going around the house, but it's always good to know that this is in the pipeline.
Keep it top of mind. Yep. Understood. Yeah, so this is an FGF21 analog. So there are a couple of these around. Akero has another one. 89 Bio has one. It's a really interesting class because obviously there's the GLP-1s that have shown pretty good data in MASH. Now we call it MASH. And, I think semaglutide's already under review for this indication. But the FGF21s are interesting, particularly because of data we saw earlier this year. So Akero had phase 2b data in February that actually showed that their FGF21 program could reverse cirrhosis in late stage patients, which kind of up to that point, I think a lot of people had been sort of resigned to the idea that once you reach that point, kind of wasn't a lot. You could kind of maybe stop progression, but you weren't actually going to reverse it. So that was a very interesting finding, and I think brought sort of a lot of renewed attention back to this asset class. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what GSK discloses about sort of further data from this program, and obviously as they push into phase 3, maybe a bit of a mini competitive run here between GSK now and some of these other biotech companies that are also pushing these assets into phase 3.
Yep, and I was remiss in not mentioning that Boston Pharma was launched by Gurnett Point back a decade ago, actually, and Boston's original MO was sort of in-licensing preclinical or early-stage clinical products, bringing them to proof of concept, and then out-licensing them, selling them, sort of like the Chorus model we saw 20 years ago or so at Lilly. And Gurnett Point, I believe, was sort of the sole investor in Boston Pharma. So it's getting its payday now. It's up for another $800 million in milestones beyond that $1.2 billion upfront. Simone, just curious if you have a take on this deal.
Jeff, I'm glad you brought up the history of Gurnett Point, because I think this, for me, is a little bit continuing the thread of the earlier conversation about ESO Biotech. So Sophie Kornowski came in as the CEO just a few years after Boston Pharma launched. And as you pointed out, she sort of narrowed the pipeline and really in quite a short number of years managed to bring that to what is, effectively a pretty nice exit. I mean, it's their lead asset, and that's a very nice upfront that she got. I think one should remember that Sophie Kornowski was previously head of partnering at Roche. So I'm going to imagine that if somebody knows how to run partnership negotiations, it's somebody who's previously been on the other side of the table as a pharma, knows how it's done, knows the patients you need, and so on. But that's not to take away also from the sort of performance as a CEO in needing to get clinical data, run clinical trials well. None of those things, the same way as it didn't for ESO Biotech, they don't just happen by themselves, right? And so I think with you've got all of these companies that really floundering, having a lot of trouble, I think looking at a couple of companies like ESO Biotech, like Boston Pharma, that have actually managed to perform in these years and, not with massive runways. Certainly even Boston Pharma didn't have a massive runway. Yeah, so, that's a very nice reward for investors in Gurnett Point and also, of course, the patients.
Yeah, so Gurnett Point invests on behalf of former Serono CEO Ernesto Bertarelli. And for our sports reference of the day, we're going sailing. He has made his mark in America's Cup circles. And, well, I guess I sort of didn't state the obvious, which these two deals are sort of linked by former Roche deal makers, Sabri and Sophie, of course. So kudos.
Who did in fact overlap for quite some time, when he was at Genentech and she was at Roche.
Yep.
Just little fun fact there for you all.
Fun facts. Kudos to them. Good. We love to see the deals. Hopefully we're gonna see some more during these shaky times, tumultuous times. Always look on the bright side of life, I guess. And now we're going to turn to Novo. Novo, of course, the big-time obesity company, and somewhat surprising news late last week, dropped Friday, I think at least after the bell for Europe. Lars Fjørgard Jorgensen, who really was the one who came in back in maybe 2017 to take over the CEO mantle, transformed Novo into a dominant player in obesity. He's now stepping aside after 8 years. During that time, the company's sales, profits, and stock all nearly tripled. Stephen, when I did my research for the piece I wrote, I looked back at all the pieces you wrote, 2017, 2019, and you wrote those pieces at a time when they were really they were coming off a couple of down years, the first in the company's history, and they were looking ahead and saying, hey, let's go for obesity, let's ditch the incremental type therapies. What's your take? You've watched this company for over a decade now in this transformation.
As you mentioned, when Lars joined, Novo was in this really difficult period where they didn't really have there wasn't a super clear plan for what the future growth was going to be. They were guiding for negative sales growth for the first time in their 100 plus year history. And there just wasn't a clear identity as to where they were going to go next. And so when he came in, they'd already done a lot of the groundwork. Semaglutide was already, I think it was just about to be approved for diabetes, but there wasn't a super clear vision yet in terms of where that next big growth driver was going to come from. And so sort of with him and with Mads Thompson as CSO, kind of together, they really built this foundation for Novo in obesity to really have this be their big bet, right? That they were going to be they basically wanted to be the world's leading obesity company in that 2017 period. And I think credit to him, credit to Mads, they did just that. I mean, the data were, for the large part, for a good 5-year stretch. I mean, it was sort of win after win after win from a clinical development perspective. Now, obviously, as you get further into it, they had a few hiccups of late. And obviously, Lilly not only kept pace with them, but, maybe surpassed them on a few metrics in terms of, generating a molecule that has greater weight loss, these sorts of things. But at one point, they were the most valuable European company, listed European company. I think at one point mid last year, the stock was 10x, I think, where it was when he came on. So for all intents and purposes, I kind of feel like he did a pretty incredible job of, bringing Novo to where it was and sort of getting the obesity market to where it is, where it's still a very nascent, very, very only small, tiny fraction of patients that have gotten to, but it's something now that 4 years ago, I guess I wouldn't have guessed that people would know, common person would be talking about GLP-1s in the same way that I feel like they were talking about COVID vaccines or Moderna in 2020. So that was something I didn't have on my, bingo card, I guess you would say, of future indication layouts.
Stephen, if you look at Novo's pipeline now and you look at that rivalry with Lilly, how Novo was ahead and Lilly's gaining ground, could it flip the other way? Is there stuff coming out behind and muscle sparing or whatever that could?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, we, as you'll recall, we wrote quite a bit about amylin earlier this year, and I think that's where potentially, obviously, Novo has a leg up. I mean, they were one of the first ones to commit to amylin early on. The data for CagriSema has been, just from a investor messaging point of view, has been disappointing. I don't think it's actually bad data. I mean, it's the largest degree of weight loss we've seen in a phase 3 study. I mean, that seems pretty good. But, I think part of it will be how they roll this out, and can they take advantage of the potential opportunity that, maybe a cagrilotide monotherapy offers. There's other stuff. I mean, so where Novo is behind is in oral. I mean, that's where Lilly, I think, has a clear advantage because they're going to have their phase 3 data later this year for their oral GLP-1, which is a small molecule. They should be able to scale that. I think they've already invested. They think they have like 500 million that they've already invested in scaling that. So that's where Novo is potentially behind. And so I know they've done several deals. I think they're trying to make up ground there, but we'll see. I mean, it's definitely not something that's going away. They're definitely still very much investing and looking to maintain their leadership position. But I think this is one where Lilly and Novo are kind of neck and neck and seem to be trading back and forth in this area in obesity.
All right. Well, Stephen, Simone, Selena, thanks as always for joining me on the pod. As Stephen said, we'll have that bonus episode, the key takeaways from BioEquity Europe, the 25th edition of that conference. That'll be out later this week. and our sister podcast. We will have that out tomorrow. I sat down with the CEO of Moonlake, and he was a voice of calm. He really calmed my nerves talking to him. Great guy, and something of a Green Bay Packers fan, which that Steven's shaking his head there. It's going to be interesting to see whether Jordan Love can dominate the Minnesota Vikings this year.
Not going to happen.
Don't mess with Minnesota. I learned Simone and my beloved Golden State Warriors learned that the hard way last week. All right. Well, special thanks as well to Cole Travis, our production man, and Kendall Square Orchestra, which does the music for all of our podcasts. We will catch you next week.
BioCentury would like to thank Jeito Capital for its continued support of our BioCentury This Week podcast.